On May 27, 2016, a catastrophic engine failure of undetermined origin redefined the flight geometry for a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The aircraft bearing civilian registration N1345B and military serial 44-90447 was operating as part of a three-ship formation. The objective was a routine promotional flight over a highly congested environment. The operational constraint materialized instantly when the primary power plant failed completely. A trailing pilot in the formation heard a brief distress call reporting smoke, then saw smoke from the aircraft before observing the Thunderbolt propeller seize. This mechanical event immediately nullified the forward thrust of the aircraft and initiated a severe aerodynamic penalty. The formation had been proceeding along the Hudson River at approximately 140 knots. More critically, the flight profile was only about 1,000 to 1,100 feet above the water. This specific vertical limitation defined the physical boundaries of the emergency and compressed the available decision window. At higher altitudes, a pilot possesses more geometric airspace to run emergency checklists, attempt engine restarts, or establish a stabilized minimum sink-glide profile. At roughly 1,000 feet above the water, that diagnostic window was extremely limited. The kinetic energy remaining in the heavy airframe had to be managed immediately to control the descent vector. The altitude constraint removed practical margins for extended diagnostic troubleshooting and forced an immediate commitment to a precise landing site. In the heavy Thunderbolt, the pilot had to preserve flying speed while accepting a steeper than normal glide. The seized propeller no longer produced thrust. It became a drag disc on the nose, driving the descent angle beyond a clean, unpowered glide. This accelerated descent forced a rigid decision trade-off governed by the urban geography around the Hudson River corridor. The Thunderbolt was operating beside one of the densest civilian environments in the United States, with Manhattan to one side, New Jersey communities to the other, and heavy infrastructure along both shorelines. Bailout remained a theoretical military option, but in that low urban corridor, it carried a grave collateral risk. Once the pilot left the cockpit, the machine would become an unguided kinetic projectile. Its mass could no longer be steered away from a civilian sector. Under these specific geographic and altitude constraints, abandoning the airframe would have transferred the emergency from the pilot to everyone below. With bailout effectively removed, the remaining solution was to keep flying the aircraft until impact. No runway option was identified before the pilot committed to the Hudson River. With each second of descent, the remaining lateral range narrowed, leaving the waterway as the only surface target that could absorb the aircraft while keeping it away from the public. The flight controls remained functional, allowing the pilot to choose the point of intersection. The pilot executed a controlled dead stick ditching on the river surface, converting the remaining kinetic energy into deceleration without cartwheeling or catastrophic structural collapse. The aircraft remained largely intact, preserving the structure and preventing collateral damage. But survival after impact depended on one configuration step before water contact. The primary procedural constraint for a ditching event requires the pilot to fully jettison the canopy prior to making contact with the water. The pilot omitted this critical step, leaving the sliding canopy partially open as the aircraft touched down. This operational omission immediately triggered a cascading mechanical consequence. The Thunderbolt is heavily nose-biased due to the mass of its forward components. When forward momentum completely ceased, the aircraft settled into the water and immediately began to sink down by the nose. The pilot now had to transition from flight operations to the emergency egress sequence in a rapidly degrading environment. The partially open canopy presented an immediate physical barrier to escape. Once the fuselage descended below the surface, the cockpit environment changed faster than any normal cockpit action could comfortably absorb. Water entered the airframe, the aircraft sank within seconds, and the pilot was no longer dealing with a dry sliding canopy in controlled flight. NTSB investigators later determined that the pilot had not jettisoned the canopy before ditching and was subsequently unable to fully open it and egress as the airplane sank. The result was not a confirmed hardware jam. It was a rapidly worsening egress problem inside a sinking fighter. Within seconds, the emergency had moved from flight control to survival inside a sinking cockpit. Following the eventual recovery of the aircraft, investigators examined the restraint system and emergency canopy release mechanisms to determine whether a hardware failure had trapped the pilot. The survival factors examination included the pilot restraints and canopy operation, including a functional test of the jettison T-handle. Testing found no evidence of an in-flight anomaly in the examined restraint or canopy release systems, and the seat restraint system showed no evidence of a jammed buckle or faulty harness strap. The finding narrowed the fatal sequence to procedure rather than a proven mechanical failure of the Egress hardware. The ditched aircraft now rested fully flooded on the riverbed, holding the mechanical evidence needed to explain the power loss, but placing that evidence beyond direct reach. The investigation shifted from aerodynamic analysis to underwater recovery. The search and recovery operation commenced against the urgency of a night rescue in a tidal urban river. Local marine response units had to locate the submerged structure and reach the pilot as quickly as possible. Public reporting later stated that divers recovered William Gordon about 3 hours after the crash, while an FDNY boat had located the downed plane after a lengthy search. A sunken target in a major urban waterway cannot be treated casually. Current, darkness, marine traffic, and riverbed sediment all complicate search and recovery, even when the last observed position is known. The site had to be located, controlled, and handed over into an organized recovery effort before the investigation could continue. Initial localization relied on the marine response units working outward from the last observed position of the aircraft before it slipped beneath the surface. Public accounts identify NYPD, FDNY, New Jersey State Police, the Coast Guard, and emergency management personnel in the search. Even after a probable location emerged, the exact attitude and condition of the aircraft could not be confirmed from the surface. The operation had to move from surface search to physical confirmation underwater. Once the sonar system painted a high probability target, the operation transitioned from a surface acoustic search to a physical underwater intervention. Identifying an anomaly on a monitor does not confirm the structural condition or exact orientation of the wreck. The police harbor unit deployed specialized dive teams to interrogate the sonar contact. Entering the Hudson River introduces an absolute environmental limit. The water column is completely saturated with suspended mud and urban silt, creating a permanent zero visibility zone. Underwater lights are completely ineffective because the illumination beam simply reflects off the suspended particulate matter, functionally blinding the diver. Public reports described police scuba divers recovering the pilot and did not document a surface-supplied umbilical system. Under those conditions, the divers had to control their descent, hold the assigned search area, and confirm the wreck by touch once they reached the riverbed. Operating blindly in the moving current, the divers swept the immediate area by feel until they made contact with the smooth aluminum skin of the Thunderbolt. They mapped the exterior shape using only their heavy diving gloves, distinguishing the wing roots from the main fuselage to orient themselves toward the cockpit section. Navigating around an aircraft structure in total darkness involves significant entanglement hazards from external antennas, control surfaces, and damaged metal plating. Within the established operational window of approximately 3 hours from the water impact, the harbor unit divers successfully located the cockpit boundary and recovered the pilot to the surface vessel. The immediate human recovery phase was complete, but the mechanical problem remained on the river floor. The heavy airframe represented a severe subsurface obstruction in a heavily trafficked commercial shipping lane. Allowing the aircraft to remain unmonitored was not legally or operationally permissible. The river environment dictated that the structure had to be marked, secured, and prepared for immediate removal before the tidal cycles could degrade the evidence or drag the airframe into deeper water. Locating the wreckage and extracting the pilot was only the initial phase of the operation. Securing the sunken aircraft for extraction would require a vastly different specialized physical interaction. In a low-visibility river environment, optical assessment of structural integrity is severely limited, forcing the handling plan to be conservative. The police harbor unit divers faced a severe handling constraint when tasked with securing the sunken Thunderbolt. The aircraft possessed a maximum gross weight in the 17,500-pound class, but that weight was enclosed in a fragile aerodynamic envelope. The exterior of the aircraft consisted of thin aluminum skin designed to manage flight loads, not careless compression from recovery gear. If lifting forces were applied through the wrong parts of the airframe, the crew The recovery could damage the structure and destroy evidence. This requirement dictated a controlled rigging process rather than an improvised lift. U.S. Army Corps accounts of similar New York Harbor recovery work describe an agreed rigging plan reviewed with partner agencies, with NYPD Harbor Unit divers securing aircraft so the Army Corps vessel can lift them. For the Thunderbolt recovery, public reporting confirms that NYPD divers secured the plane and that it was loaded onto an Army Corps provided ship equipped with a crane. The exact underwater strap routing, structural contact points, and balance calculations were not publicly documented. The safest documentary description is therefore procedural rather than instructional. Divers secured the airframe for lifting under the recovery plan, while the surface crew prepared the crane vessel to take the load. The rigging had to respect the aircraft's fragile skin, its heavy engine, and the need to preserve investigative evidence. But the available record does not support a detailed reconstruction of rivet tracing, hand-excavated tunnels, or exact sling placement. The aircraft was secured for extraction without publicly reported additional handling damage. However, transitioning the 8-ton structure from the river floor to a surface vessel introduces a vastly different operational threshold. Connecting the established rigging to a surface winch forces the operation to manage the severe physical stress of an intact, fully flooded airframe breaking the surface tension of the water. Extracting a sunken aircraft requires managing a strict geometry limit at the exact boundary between the water and the air. The tactile rigging established securely against the forward wing roots provided the necessary load path to the surface. However, transferring that load from the riverbed requires specialized heavy machinery. The following morning, crews began the salvage operation. Public reporting placed the start of the recovery at around 10:30 a.m. after the crash at about 7:30 p.m. the previous evening. A ship provided by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, equipped with a crane, was used to recover the submerged Thunderbolt after divers secured the aircraft. The operational task shifted from locating the wreckage to lifting a heavy, waterlogged fighter from the river without turning the recovery itself into the next source of damage. The operational constraint shifted immediately from underwater search to controlled load management. The aircraft had been submerged, which meant the airframe was waterlogged and heavy, even before accounting for mud, suction, and the irregular geometry of a damaged fighter. The crane crew had to lift the structure carefully enough to preserve the airframe for investigators while also clearing a navigable waterway. The available public record does not document the exact lift sequence, gauge readings, pause points, or order in which the nose, wings, and tail broke the surface. What can be stated reliably is that divers secured the aircraft, the Army Corps provided a crane-equipped ship, and the crane lifted the plane for transport. The recovery therefore depended on coordination between the dive team, the vessel crew, and the agencies managing the river response, not on a publicly confirmed sequence of timed drainage pauses. With the aircraft recovered from the river, it was loaded for transport and taken to a heliport facility where federal investigators could examine it. The maritime recovery operation transformed the Thunderbolt from a submerged obstruction into physical evidence available for aviation investigators. The recovery of the airframe provided investigators with the physical evidence necessary to examine the engine failure, but it did not allow them to verify an exact mechanical origin. The NTSB record states that the wreckage was recovered from the river the following day and moved to a storage facility, where additional examinations were performed by an FAA inspector. The primary investigative requirement was to separate what could be learned from the internal mechanical trauma from what had been obscured by impact damage, submersion, and the engine's own catastrophic destruction. To isolate the failure, the inspector examined the power plant as far as the damage allowed. The engine showed evidence of internal seizure. However, damage inside the crankcase prevented cylinder removal and prevented full disassembly of the engine. That limitation is central to the case. Investigators could not complete a methodical teardown of all 18 cylinders, and they could not map an exact cascade through each piston, connecting rod, valve, and cylinder wall. The evidence was strong enough to confirm catastrophic internal engine failure, but not precise enough to identify a single initiating component with certainty. As the examination reached the supercharger evidence, the physical source of the catastrophic failure remained severe but not fully resolved. The engine used a complex turbo supercharger system to support high-altitude performance, and investigators found oil and metallic fragments inside the engine's supercharger. That finding mattered because the supercharger was identified as a possible initiating area of failure. But the available examination did not establish the condition of individual impeller blades, did not document a breached heat shield, and did not prove a specific high-temperature gas containment failure. The evidence pointed toward catastrophic internal damage, with the supercharger as a possible source, not a confirmed and fully reconstructed origin. The sequence of destruction could not be conclusively mapped, but the examination did identify severe damage in the lower section of the radial engine. Investigators noted that the number 18 cylinder was damaged in a manner consistent with an in-flight occurrence. That finding placed the damage inside the engine before the water landing sequence, but it did not allow investigators to prove a precise piston and ring seizure or reconstruct the entire cascade through the cylinder assembly. The number 18 cylinder and the supercharger evidence both mattered, but the excessive internal damage prevented a definitive origin story. The physical state of the engine explained why the power loss was sudden, total, and irreversible, but it did not identify one precise mechanical trigger. The evidence of internal seizure, the damaged number 18 cylinder, and the oil and metallic fragments inside the supercharger showed that the engine had suffered catastrophic internal failure. The damage was severe enough to prevent a meaningful airborne restart or continued power generation. Yet the exact origin of the failure remained undetermined. The limited examination closed the causal loop only as far as the evidence allowed. The power plant failure was catastrophic and mechanical, but its initiating point could not be proven because the internal damage prevented full disassembly. The pilot was presented with a massive, unpowered aerodynamic penalty generated by catastrophic engine failure. The record supports that he successfully flew the heavy airframe to the surface of the water under extreme operational constraints. The final fatal factor was procedural. The canopy was not jettisoned before ditching, and the pilot was unable to fully open it and egress as the aircraft sank.